have an already created infrastructure to provide immediate support to moments when there are racial harassment and discrimination such as these. Yes, we have an infrastructure to provide some form of complaint mechanism and human rights interference, but the emotional and the community aspect, particularly that belonging is a theme that we're all struggling with. That type of infrastructure is not in place. And so my question is, what would that infrastructure look if you could take a magic wand and make it happen?
Go first. I think that's, oh, yeah, I'm on. That's why I think we created a Black Student Union. We saw a gap and we had to fill it ourselves. I think about a lot of the work we do and how much labor it is, how emotional it is, how much February sucks. You get to Black History Month and you're like, it's 1 week, it's midterm season, and now I have to talk about my trauma for free over and over and over again because the university didn't foresee this coming. And so, yeah, so it's a very big question, but it's about like, where does the university want to put its money? Like, where does who is it investing in? Because if this was a STEM issue, then maybe they would invest in it.
I don't know. I don't know how that institution would look, or how that mechanism would work, or how that would look. I think that it would come through trial and error. I think that it would come through taking a step and trying, and then, okay, this doesn't work. We had the input of the Black students. Okay, maybe we can tweak this. But as Dr. Handel says, there has to be effort. And you just can't say that, well, we don't know what to create, and so we haven't created anything. There has to be some sort of effort and some sort of trial and error. I grew up in the church. My father's a pastor, my grandfather's a pastor. My mother was a deaconess. My paternal grandfather was a pastor. My maternal grandfather was a pastor. So I come from a long lineage of pastors. And in the church, we have something that's called the Blessed Hope. And the Blessed Hope is that after all of this, after we would have gone through all of this traumatic experience here on earth, that there is something waiting beyond. The Blessed Hope tells us that something perfect is coming to the imperfect world. I want to put, and I want to stick that Blessed Hope right here, but not necessarily in this perfect way, because I don't believe that us as Black people are looking for a perfect solution. We just want effort. We don't want defensiveness when we tell you you're wrong. We don't want abrasiveness and this need to retaliate when we tell you and call out your racism. We want you to be humble and to learn from your mistake and to grow. And I think Robin DiAngelo puts it perfectly in her book, White Fragility, again, when she says that I was socialized in a racist system. I cannot escape racism. Even though I am a progressive, I claim progressive politics, there are ways and there are mechanisms where I still mess up and where I still get it wrong. And so I appreciate when people of color and Black people call out my racism. So when the racism is called out, when we tell you you're getting it wrong, you've messed up, take a step back, don't get defensive, and then try again. And this is how I bring it back to the mechanics of dealing with, and immediately dealing with something. Try. We say it didn't work, step back, think about it again, and then come back.
additional comments from folks on the stage before we move to questions or cue cards? All right. Thank you so much. Anybody has a question? This is an opportunity. And if there are any cue cards, I'm more than welcome to start looking through it right now.
Hi. Hello. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for your time. I think that's it's like it means a lot. I think for a lot of us here. And my husband and I are expecting our first child, and so. You know, I like to think that we're looking at a hopeful world in the future. And, you know, I read all the books that you mentioned, but there's this guy who wrote Eliminate All the Brutes. His name is Sven Lundquist, and he talks about how racism was born. And I think for me, it was one of the first times that I really understood how colonialism took over, you know, and so how anti-blackness exists, you know. But then I see things that are so obvious where, you know, we haven't colonized the world, but they have, and they've taken from people, and yet, you know, we're called, you know, thieves and liars. And so I don't understand, I guess my question for you, for the panel is, how is it that a thief can call the person who's being stolen from a thief, and that just continues to always be like that, and how do we also, you know, combat our own internal racism against ourselves? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
I guess I'll start then. The first thing is that white people have always known themselves through black bodies. That whiteness is constructed based on what blackness is. Whiteness is, or blackness is, what whiteness is not. Black is loud, so white is subtle. Black is angry, so white is calm. Black is aggressive, so white is, and so on and so forth. Through that dynamic of knowing oneself, we've come to this reality that this is right and everything else is wrong, and everything else is this anomaly, right? And I'm attempting to answer the question, but just all the pieces aren't coming together right now, and so I'm going to relinquish that.
Yeah, frankly, it's how I summarize the question is, how did racism all start? And how is it that these discourses of anti-black racism still persist irrespective of facts to the contrary? And historically speaking, from my understanding, even prior European contact with Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, there were already mythologies about the people, the heretics, the people who live in that part of the world. There were already mythologies that were also happening amongst Europeans themselves. And so before contact, a discourse was born in regards to cannibalism, in regards to people that are half humans, half animals, in regards to people that look like apes. And then the sailors who would go all the way to the borders of Africa will come with these discourses and go back to Europe, and you make a lot of money by creating these phenomenal stories of, look at what I found. Look at, and I believe this permeated into, it also became a tool in part to justify what would eventually become European colonialism. You have to portray somebody as danger, as a threat, as somewhat abnormal, as subpar, in order to be able to sensitize a population to, agree with you on the forms of violence you're going to put on other people's bodies. It requires a spiritual loss. It requires moral loss. And let us also be aware that technologies of violence that were, at least some technologies of violence that colonialism brought upon black bodies and indigenous bodies also happened amongst Europeans prior colonialism. And I would think that as a result, the fight between Christianity and paganism, and the stealing of the land, the feudal lords and all that, they were colonizing themselves prior they start colonizing us. And I would think that the memory of that, and maybe the fear of not wanting to be on the receiving side of that, may sensitize people to wanting to already be in agreement that this is justifiable, right? Taking somebody else's land is justifiable, and so on and so forth. So racism makes a lot of money.
I guess I don't need this anymore. I want to actually kind of turn this around a little. It's interesting when we actually talk about history and colonialism and other matters, that even that is white-centered. The reality for us as people of color and people of African descent specifically, people seem to have forgotten that the Moors actually took over Europe, what is now Europe, right? They were in the British Isles. They were in Spain. Like a lot of the architecture all over Europe, right, have a Moorish root. The reality is that all of us, European or not, have forgotten the old history of what and who we are. And we have accepted a narrative which is not correct as fact and as history. The people from North Africa and Africa and the continent were very diverse. They were very skilled. They were philosophers. They created things, when you read back the elements of health and language and many other aspects of where we are now, like toilets, right? Who invented them? Again, we need to do some work. And I know all of us are very busy, and we don't spend a lot of time doing it, but the reality is that the information is out there if we're willing to dig for it. Some of the information has been covered up because folks don't want you to know that, in fact, black folks did stuff way back when, before Europeans ever thought to do it, right? They also don't want you to know that even in places like Ethiopia, right, that, in fact, wars were fought. The Italians, Italians will tell you about them being beaten by the people in that area, and the fact that they have great respect for the people in that area because they lost wars, right? Again, I don't know. When I was a kid, 70-something years ago, I remember being in England and people talking about Timbuktu and Constantinople and on and on and on, right? And no one talks about that stuff any longer, right? That is not information that is taught in schools. And the nursery rhymes that we used to actually recite, we don't recite anymore. But those things taught us and teach us more about the world than what we understand and know now. Black cultures were great cultures and helped support the world evolve. But most of us don't know that any longer. And that's why we can be demonized and destroyed and undermined, because folks don't really see us as fully valuable and strong as they are, and equal to them.
So there were two parts to your question, or two aspects to your question. I think everybody's really addressed very well the first aspect. The second aspect is rather more difficult when you talk about internalized racism. And I will mention something, and I would also say we lost something when we lost the Black Canadian Studies Association having its own conference. Because the discussions that we need to have, which are very hard to have, which we don't have within Blackness. What are the differences? Where have people come from? What are our histories around gender, around sexuality, around places that we've come from? Not only the histories, because the histories can tend to make us homogenize Black identity, right? We all came from Africa. That can become romanticized. Stuart Hall suggests another way of looking at our identities, which is what is the geography of your identity? Where have you come from? Who are the people who are double diasporic, right? Who is dominant within Blackness, right? What are the differences between folks who've been around many generations, immigrants from the Caribbean, immigrants from Africa, rich versus poor, all of that? And how do we pit those things sometimes against one another? Those are discussions that should happen in a BCSA that maybe are not happening yet, where we can talk in-house, family to family, right? And I want us to disabuse ourselves of the idea of Blackness being pure victimhood, right? Blackness is complex, right? Again, Stuart Hall starts to come to your mind. He keeps coming to your mind. Stuart Hall made another comment, which is, the project might be correct, but some of the methods you choose to achieve that, your question was, how should this be done, right? We have a righteous project, which is to end anti-Black racism. It doesn't mean that all the steps we take, the measures we take are correct. That is what Stuart Hall called without guarantees. We need to have a kind of modesty, not just an air of moral superiority, but a kind of modesty to our Black identity that says, I might not always get it right. The same thing that Shelby said, you might need to step back. We might sometimes need to step back. We do need to look at one another. For me, for you, you guys are having your first child. For me, this work became so urgent because late in life, I became a father. It's like, whoa, this is the world in which I'm bringing this kid up in. Oh my goodness. For me, I mean, and we don't even talk about our privileges. There's a privilege I have having come from Africa. Nobody told me, you can't get a degree, you can't be a doctor, you can't. Those things don't make sense to me. My professors were black. So the big celebration people have when they say, Rexford graduated high school. Oh, it's like, why? Why is that a celebration, right? I take it for granted that people do this. But when you're here, you all of a sudden begin to believe your kids are going to be told messages about who they are that are unbelievable, that I did not come from. I'm hearing them now, I'm reacting to them, but I know they don't make sense. My kid might not know they don't make sense. So we have to have those conversations, which are really hard within blackness, right? That we don't operate from a sense of pure moral superiority or a sense of innocence.
All right. Because of the sake of time, I'm actually going to ask 2 questions, and I would like all panelist members to respond to one, and it's up to you to choose which you're drawn to. So the first question is, what advice would you provide to those coming to Vancouver and looking to support and participate in black spaces within the city? What advice do you have for them? The other one is, anti-black racism exists in multiple communities, white and people of color communities, especially in the forms of subtle racism, friendly racism. And so the question is, can you speak to the trauma presented in POC, people of color, allyship?
Can you repeat the first question?
Feels a little bit like an exam.
You're on the hot seat. So the first question is advice to people coming to Vancouver who are black and who are looking to support and participate in black spaces. The second theme is about lateral racial violence within POC communities towards black people and how you'd speak to that.
The last question is trauma within POC communities toward black people?
It is about the anti-black racism within POC communities towards black people, and if you can speak to the trauma that is presented by that.
So I'm going to try to answer the second question, and I say try because I will try. The first thing is I don't know. The second thing is I'm very wary of when we group people into this category called people of color. We assume that whiteness is not a color and that everybody else has this knowledge of racism and should be knowledgeable about racism and then thus sit on a stage and educate white people about racism. So I am very, very cautious about when we group everybody to people of color because it is not my job to teach you about racism. Everything's out there. Everything exists. You can Google, you can do the research, you can do the labor. And whiteness is not outside of color. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I honestly can't answer that. I honestly cannot speak to the trauma that may exist between communities or black communities and the question was racism that exists within there?
Yeah, from people of color, from non-black people of color towards black people.
Okay. So racism from non-black people to black people. Okay. I'll come back to that. But non-black people, let's tarry there just a little bit longer. going down this line or this argument of people of color and separating from white people of color cannot be racist. Racism deals with the system of power and privilege. People of color can be prejudiced. We can have particular stereotypes about white people and other people, but they cannot be prejudiced. They cannot be racist. They cannot group among themselves and create laws and systems that disenfranchise white people, that disenfranchise other people, particularly in the Americas, Canada, the United States of America, where the majority is white people. People of color cannot be racist.
Right, so people of color cannot be racist to white people, but can non-black people of color be racist to black people?
They can be prejudiced.
They can be prejudiced.
In my opinion. In my very limited scholarly opinion, and the scholars down there and here may have a different opinion, they cannot be racist. They can be prejudiced. Particularly in the context.
And why is that?
Particularly in the context of Canada and the United States.
Okay.
Because racism has to deal with grouping among yourselves and creating laws and systems that disenfranchise other people.
Okay.
Is it okay? Oh, is this on? Is it okay if I don't answer the question?
It's okay, I did it.
I want to speak about a culture of whiteness. Yes. And I also want to speak about why these issues trigger white people so much. Because I think the reason that they trigger white people so much is because they don't understand what it's like to get up in the morning and have to think about how does every action I do, how does the way I move throughout the world affect other people. So you can put on a hat, for example, and you're thinking, wow, that's funny to me, that's humorous to me, that doesn't affect me. Like I can go home and I can keep living my life and I just did this one thing because it was funny. But when you have to go through those experiences time and time again, every single day, and they suck, and then after that you're asked to educate other people, you have to think about how exhausting that is, and also like how are you helping people? How are you helping yourself when you do these things? Like when you how like what energy are you putting into the world when you put on a hat? Okay, that's it. That's my statement.
Thank you.
I'll be quick. Advice one might give to Black people coming to Vancouver. Meanwhile, I would suggest that they actually, if they're on Facebook, they connect with Black people in BC, or in Vancouver, rather. They will connect with lots of folks. I think that there's more than 4,200 people online now on Meanwhile Black in Vancouver. And there are places that actually post events that are taking place. Most of the community centers actually list activities that might be put on by Black groups. And the other thing is that both for men and women, you get a basketball and go out on almost any court, basketball court in Vancouver, and you can hook up with at least one other Black person there that's tossing the ball at the hoops. as a form of exercise. So it's not as easy in Vancouver as it is in many other places, but there are opportunities, and the community is attempting to actually provide more elements and opportunities for people of African descent to kind of connect with each other and know that we are here and we are committed to supporting each other. If I could make one announcement, today, and probably all of you know this already, is Bob Marley's birthday. He would have been 75. And Bob Marley is one of those people. People want to only focus on his music. But the other important thing about Bob Marley is that he had a sense of history. He knew of his roots in terms of his connections to Europe and his connections to Africa, and he made sure that those bits and pieces were part of his music. I think most of us remember his song Buffalo Soldier, and because most folk, when that song came out, didn't seem to remember that there were black folks that actually were in the West. And many of his other songs as well were basically a history lesson. And the other major song that I think a lot of people love about Bob Marley and his music is to recognize that it's one love. We all come from a common mother, and that's our humanness, is that we are all connected to each other. And again, we need to look after each other and make sure that we all survive.
I guess I'll try to answer the second question if I understood it correctly. I think what it makes me think of is thinking about Canada as such a prime example of the creation of a white identity, because everybody who's not Indigenous to these lands is of immigrant ancestry, and in such a small amount of time, more and more people have become white. Even within the last 50 years, Italians, Eastern Europeans who were previously not white upon arrival have now been subsumed into whiteness. And I think speaking about how anti-Blackness manifests among other racialized groups, other people of color, part of that is a process of assimilation, and part of assimilating to whiteness and assimilating to Canadianness is the continued oppression and marginalization of